My name is Samuel.
And I'm Luke.
We are interns at Montgomery Community Media. Welcome back to our Youth Talk. Our focus for today is voting, the how, the where, and much more.
Today we're joined by a very special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself for us?
Hello, my name is Nile Blass. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the DMV regional organizer at the League of Women Voters. So that means I work with our state and local leagues in the region, but I also do a lot of political strategy and program development around young voters, specifically 18 to 30.
So let's jump right in. Do you want to explain to us what the voting process looks like for young voters coming from a first-time voter for the upcoming election?
Yeah, I mean, lucky for you, when we're looking at the landscape of voting and access to the ballot, it's getting a little complicated state to state, but you still have a lot of accessibility as it relates to Maryland. So for one, you have the very traditional, you're assigned poll center or voting center, and you can check Vote 411, our nonpartisan location, online, accessible phone, laptop, probably other forms of media that gives you that access and gives you that specific information for your specific ballot. But anyway, there's a traditional going to your polling center and voting with that either electronic ballot or a written ballot. In Maryland, you also have an absentee ballot, so that allows you to vote basically where you're not designated spaces. So that can be that you're a stay-at-home dad and you just can't make it to the ballot box. It could be that you went to the wrong polling center and so you can't make it in time, but they'll let you submit your ballot there, so that's absentee. And then there's also mail-in ballot, which allows you to fill out your ballot at home and then mail it into the state of, your board of elections, I believe, is where you mail it for Maryland. So there's a lot of different ways.
Cool. What would you say the importance of young voters in Montgomery County is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes, especially because we don't see as much of a engagement long-term civically with young people, we can downplay that population of people, but I think it's really essential. I think by the time we hit 2030, the vast majority of voters who are going to be eligible to vote in the United States as a whole are going to be Gen Z and millennials. And so as you're kind of priming and aging into that demographic, it's really important to be building out the information and the passion and engagement for voting. I don't think it's ever too late to have an engaged voter, but if you've not been spoken to about politics, why it matters, how it matters, if the first time you're hearing about it is you're 18, well, now we're doing a little bit of a harder sell because I've never had to engage with it before. But what I would say is really the most important is not even just the national elections when we're looking at the president or the U.S. senatorship. Like, AOC and Matt Gaetz are interesting people to read about, right? But most of what's going to be taking place in this landscape is going to be on that local ballot, right? So if we're looking not even at candidates, but amendments for 2024 in the general election, there's an amendment to decide whether or not we're gonna add reproductive freedom to the state constitution. That's super important. When you're looking at your Board of Education about whether or not you have DEI initiatives in the face of the affirmative action case in the Supreme Court, whether or not you're going to continue to have AP African American history and other really important cases, Biden has very little to do with that. That happens at the local level. So I think people having engagement not just with the U.S. senators and all that type of stuff, but I believe on the ballot for Montgomery County, you're going to have judges for the Supreme Court, the appellate court, your local circuit court, I believe the 6th, which covers your county specifically, county clerks, a lot of that individual unique work. I think that's why it matters.
Hi, I'm Delmar Patterson, and I'm out here asking interns, what do they know about elections?
Do you know when the primary is?
No.
I want to say it's in July.
September?
Mm-hmm.
What is the electoral college and how does it work?
I don't know.
I'll take the next question.
What are swing states and their significance?
Next question.
Swing states are states that are not normally Democrat or Republican. They usually differ between the two.
And they're important because they can make the president be the president. I don't.
What age do you have to be to vote? 18.
18.
18.
Tough question. 18?
And what is a primary election and how does it differ?
I don't know.
Primary is when you narrow down the candidates.
And then the general election is when you vote on either one of those candidates.
Now that we asked MCM interns, let's ask the public.
Do you know when the primary is?
No.
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 This is going to end real quick. No.
What is the electoral college and how does it work?
Girl.
Isn't that political?
I don't know. Like the area where people vote?
What are swing states and how are they significant?
What are swing states? I don't know.
Probably Michigan.
Swing states can go one way or the other, and I hope they go all Democratic.
The fourth question is, what age do you have to be to vote?
18, of course. I do know that.
18. 18.
What is the primary election and how does it differ from general election?
can't give you that answer. I can't.
I don't know. I don't know.
The primary finds the primary front runner for the entire election.
Thank you.
So you're saying people need to educate themselves on like a lower level, like not like the federal government, but more like their local governments?
Yeah, and I think that allows us to kind of get rid of some of the dissatisfaction, I think rightfully so, that a lot of young people feel. I think that when we look from the top to the bottom, it feels very easy to have your issues be ignored and overlooked. You're not seeing yourself in policy reflections. Obviously, this issue is a little bit down the line for you all, but even when we're looking at young voters, there was a lot of promises around student loan forgiveness, and that's not been seen. But there's movement around that at the local level. There's conversations to be had there, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's less about even just decentering national politics so much as it is acknowledging that there are a lot of different avenues and intersections of how and when it matters. And if we make it more about the local, I think people can feel more like their vote has a direct impact. Because if you vote for Biden or whomever or Trump or right, you vote for them, you can kind of feel a disassociation between that ballot cast and the result. But if you're voting for your mayor, he might live down the street from you. You'll know if he's doing your job. You'll get to see him at the mailbox and be like, what's going on, right? And so you'll be able to feel a little bit more of an incentive and connection, I think, when you care about local.
Yeah, definitely. What Gen Z people are trying to, talk about voting, it gets a little bit toxic, it gets a little sensitive. I was like, oh, who you trying to vote for next president? And they don't really put a lot of attention to that,
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple of really unique things around Gen Z. Is that one, we're seeing a decentering of partisanship, right? So I think a lot of young voters are more interested in issue areas. I care about reproductive health. I care about student loan forgiveness. I care about racial equity. I don't necessarily care about the person. And because I think national politics are still really stratified between parties, it's really hard to feel like I should care about a Republican, Libertarian, Democrat, whatever, because I'm not seeing the results that I need in my local community. I also think that, especially like we have a Congress gridlock right now, we're probably not going to see anything move until 2024. And even after 2024, it's unclear as to whether or not it's going to be moving in directions that are viable for young people. But, a place that I really refer to for data, which I think is super helpful when you're looking at Gen Z, is Tufts University's Circle. And it's basically a research center that is very explicit about not just young voters broadly, but what's the rural environment look like versus the urban, how are voters of color showing up versus their white counterparts, where are the disseminations and where we stand. And when we're looking at some of the issues that are bringing young people to the ballot box in 2024, it's right to choose and other forms of reproductive health access. It's gun violence, and that's particularly prevalent in communities where we're not just talking about those once-in-a-lifetime incidents of mass violence, but day to day. Like that's maybe not a Montgomery County issue, but when we're looking at the DMV circuit, unfortunately, that's a Baltimore and a DC issue, right? And so that's directly related. And I think that's what's also really important is that when we look at the data, we see a separation between what's bringing young people who did vote in the last cycle to the table versus what young people who didn't vote to the table were considering. And I think the things that I really like to emphasize in that is that voting is not synonymous with caring, right? I think that everything is a choice. Choosing not to vote is meaning that I have different initiatives, requirements, priorities that make it separate and apart for me to cast that ballot. And sometimes it's literal. If I'm in a community where the sidewalks are broken down and if it rains, it floods, and it's the day to vote, I'm not gonna vote. And so we would interpret that as a lack of care when really that's an environmental, social, structural issue that's between you and the ballot box, right? And so when we're looking at, for example, young people who didn't feel empowered to vote or didn't get to the ballot box last time, their big priorities is minimum wage, access to housing. And what I think that really communicates too is that when we're looking at young people, politics can oftentimes be a privilege. And if my priority in the moment is survival, I'm hungry, I'm taking care of my siblings, I have all of these immediate needs, those represent barriers to getting to the ballot box and represent barriers to feeling educated to even get there when I do. Because there's a lot of people who, by the time they're actually getting to the polling station, they haven't actually had the opportunity to look at the candidates to actually know what they're voting for, right? So I feel like that's a lot of words, but I think there's a lot at play when we're talking about young people. But the one thing I always really try to emphasize is that it's maybe deep dissatisfaction and frustration, but it's not apathy.
You just read my mind there, talking about going to the ballots without knowing who you're voting for. Coming from someone who doesn't really know who's in the like local elections? Where can I educate myself about that?
Well, one thing I say, Maryland, I give it props. I think the Board of Elections is actually pretty transparent with people who are on the ballot. I think if you want another nonpartisan resource outside of the league, there's also Ballotpedia, which is really well up to date when it comes to what's on the ballot, giving context for what certain amendments mean, even breaking down what a yes versus a no vote would mean within the context of the ballot question. But again, I will emphasize Vote 411, which is our nonpartisan resource, right?
And what I like.
Yeah, I got to, right?
Oh yeah,
it's literally
100%,
my job.
100%.
But no, because what I appreciated about it is that it's not even just you're Googling what's at stake in Montgomery County. You put in your exact address and it gives you specifically what's going to relate to you.
Wow.
So what's on your ballot, whether or not your polling center has been changed, whether or not voter ID or other supplementals that you'll need to provide to be able to vote, whether you need to have those on hand. And then what's also really great about Vote 411, and I think in Maryland, compared to a lot of other states, we have a high rate of participation, is that we send out questions both in Spanish and in English, right? That's super important, to candidates, and we ask them, what's your stance on X, Y, and Z? And so it's not just knowing what their name is or knowing what their party is, but this is their stance on reproductive freedom. This is their stance on rebuilding infrastructure. And I think that allows you to get a lot more of an in-depth understanding of who they are as individuals, and thus, whether or not you want to vote for them.
Yeah.
You did say, you mentioned a lot of these things, like how to include more of the youth in the voting. Unfortunately for me, I haven't voted yet. I'm here being 19 and still haven't voted. Yeah, definitely having a hard time to definitely vote. I feel like my vote doesn't really matter. I feel like those Democrats, it's mostly about those Democrats and Republicans. It's funny how we divide ourselves, Everyone's playing by their own team. They're focused on their own interests and stuff like that. And I feel like that also goes with the local government as well. Everyone goes where their interests. Am I correct?
I think that that's correct only if you end your work at the ballot box. So I think two things come to mind. One is I view that perspective more of a failure on the system than on the individuals itself. I think oftentimes we get past the election and we look at populations of voters. That even happens with black voters if we're looking at the larger context. And we're like, why didn't you save the country? Why didn't you do something, right? And we're not dealing with a larger form of participation. I think it's like, yes, you vote for that person, but are you going to your town halls? Are you writing letters? Are you keeping up with whether or not their campaign promises are translating to administrative actions? Are you not just communicating with them, but maybe some of their partners, right? So if you have a city council member who's your direct district and they're not meeting your needs, you can also be sending messaging, letters, calls, visiting the offices of those who are like juxtaposed to them in other districts saying, hey, I'm not your direct constituent, but I know that you support this bill and I need you to know that your coworker, my representative, is dragging their feet, and I need them to move on that. And I want you to tell them that there are their constituents who feel like they have to go to other elected representatives to be heard, and they should be embarrassed by it, right? Yeah. I think that you really have to pressure people, because I think that for better or for worse, I think people do what is easy and what is convenient. And I think that if people feel that I can ignore young voters and not really engage and follow through because they won't vote, maybe they'll tweet, and that's like kind of bad for a day. I get ate up, tagged, but then nothing actually happens, and then I get to vote my increase of pay for the next year, then that doesn't really help, right? So I think for better or for worse, I think an attitude that I always have is that, it's really nice and hopeful that a lot of our elected officials are genuine, but whether or not they are, if you put the fire under them, it doesn't matter, right? And so I think that's always been my attitude. It's what you bring to it.
Definitely something to bring in the table,
I need some advice from you, from a young person in a big elections coming up. What would you recommend for us?
I would think about what your big priorities are in terms of what you would want to see in your local community, in your state, and in the national conversation, and then augment your vote to those values, right? I think oftentimes when we get to the ballot box and we haven't been informed, if we haven't researched in advance, it can kind of get really frustrating and complicated, and there's a lot of pressure because you got to disseminate all of these thoughts that you haven't been able to gather before into this moment of like electoral action. So I think that early voting starts May 2nd or May 3rd for Maryland, right? And you can register to vote in Maryland up until the day of elections, right? So I think that if you plan to vote May 6th, at least by May 3rd, go to Vote 401, go to Ballotpedia, and be researching what's on the ballot. And then be having conversations with your parents or your friends around, well, this is what I think it means. Or if you don't know what it means, like, look into it. So, like, there might be a generic understanding of this constitutional amendment meeting reproductive health, but go deeper into reading the text of it. So when they say reproductive health, do they mean access to contraceptives and abortion? Do they mean access to X, Y, and Z? Like, really knowing the particulars of what it is and how you feel about it and how your community feels about it. Because you're not always voting for yourself, right?
Yeah.
So, like, oftentimes we make reproductive freedom a gendered conversation, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be. But you're like, this amendment might not matter for me, but does it matter for my sister? Or does it matter for people in my life who are capable of being pregnant? And so thinking about how you're voting, not just for yourself, but your community. So I guess those are my little overhead of recommendations.
I really take that last piece to heart there. I think that was really good.
What was your experience in the voter registration?
I think one thing that I benefit from is that my family has always cared a lot about politics, right? So when my grandmother and my mother lived in Iowa, they were organizing caucuses. When we came here, my mom was on city councils, and I was on side of my DS while she was doing that work. So I think it was very intrinsic to me. And I think that when I became 18, it wasn't a question of if I was going to register. It's like, when is Maryland going to mail it to us? But I think that that's a privilege. Being like ingrained and raised in an environment where political engagement matters and was seen, and I saw the impacts of it mattered.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think my mom wouldn't talk to me if I didn't vote. So
It's a great place to end it. Thank you so much for joining us.
thank you.
I'm Luke,
And I'm Samuel.
and this has been Youth Talks.